Every year, an astounding 100 billion garments are produced worldwide, yet the majority of these clothes end up discarded in landfills within less than a year. For instance, the average American throws away approximately 37 kilograms of clothing annually. The question then arises, where do all these discarded clothes go? Unfortunately, managing textile waste in developed nations is extremely expensive. Instead of bearing the costs of recycling damaged or unwanted clothing, many companies and countries choose to export these items to poorer nations. These exports are often accompanied by narratives that claim to reduce waste or provide affordable clothing for underprivileged communities. However, these claims often mask a deeper, more troubling reality. What appears to be a charitable act is, in truth, a transfer of waste management responsibilities to poorer nations that lack the infrastructure to handle such an influx of trash. This disingenuous narrative makes it seem like developed countries are aiding those in need, while in reality, they are shifting their environmental and economic burdens elsewhere. When clothing is shipped to developing countries under the guise of donations, many people in wealthier nations believe they are doing good by contributing to this system. They assume their discarded garments will help those in need. The unfortunate truth, however, is that much of this clothing is unusable. Instead of providing aid, it becomes an additional burden for the recipient countries. In an era when environmental awareness is on the rise, companies in developed nations often frame the export of secondhand clothing as part of eco-friendly recycling initiatives. But the reality is far from green. Most of these garments, especially those made of synthetic materials like polyester, are not biodegradable and cannot be recycled in the recipient countries. The lack of appropriate recycling technology in many developing nations means these garments accumulate in landfills, where they persist for centuries or pollute natural ecosystems. Supporters of the second-hand clothing trade sometimes argue that it creates jobs in recipient countries. It's true that thousands of workers, traders, and vendors in local markets are involved in selling second-hand clothes. However, the benefits are often overstated. Most of these workers operate in informal sectors with low wages and precarious working conditions. Moreover, the influx of cheap second-hand clothing undermines local textile industries, which once provided stable, better-paying jobs. In fact, the local textile industry in many recipient countries has been decimated by the flood of inexpensive second-hand clothes. Take Kenya, for example, where the second-hand clothing trade, locally known as mitumba, has been thriving since the 1980s. Initially, these clothes were seen as a blessing, an affordable way for low-income communities to access high-quality garments. Over time, however, the overwhelming volume of imported second-hand clothes has crippled Kenya's domestic textile industry. In the 1980s, Kenya had a vibrant and competitive textile sector, employing over 500,000 people either directly or indirectly. But as mitumba imports increased, local factories couldn't compete with the low prices of second-hand garments. Many iconic textile manufacturers like Rivatex and Kikomi were forced to close their doors. By the 2000s, the number of workers employed in Kenya's textile sector had plummeted to around 20,000. This collapse didn't just affect factory workers, it also harmed cotton farmers who supplied raw materials for the industry. The situation is even worse for unsold second-hand clothing. It is estimated that around a third of all imported second-hand clothes in Kenya are discarded because they are damaged or of poor quality. These items end up as waste, further straining Kenya's already limited waste management systems. Synthetic garments, which dominate modern clothing, are particularly problematic because they do not biodegrade. In Nairobi, the Dandora landfill is overflowing with discarded textiles, posing both environmental and public health risks. Moreover, the environmental impact extends beyond landfills. Many discarded garments find their way into rivers, lakes, and oceans, exacerbating water pollution and harming marine ecosystems. For communities living near these polluted waterways, the consequences are severe, affecting not only their environment but also their health. When unsold clothing is burned as a quick solution to disposal, harmful chemicals like dioxins are released into the air, posing serious respiratory and carcinogenic risks to nearby populations. The economic exploitation in the second-hand clothing trade is another hidden cost. Often, clothing labeled as donations is sold to traders in recipient countries, who then sell it in local markets. This creates a profit loop that benefits middlemen in both the donor and recipient countries, while leaving the local populations with the environmental and economic burdens. Additionally, customs evasion is a rampant issue. Many importers underreport the value or quantity of second-hand clothes to avoid paying proper taxes, costing governments like Kenya's millions in lost revenue annually. Public health concerns add another layer of complexity to this problem. Many of the second-hand clothes shipped to Kenya are not properly cleaned or processed before export. As a result, they can carry bacteria, mold, or even parasites, potentially spreading diseases. The lack of regulation around these imports makes it difficult to ensure the safety of the clothes being distributed. The cultural impact of mitumba cannot be ignored either. Over time, the dominance of second-hand Western clothing has eroded traditional dress practices in Kenya and similar countries. Younger generations are increasingly drawn to cheap Western styles, neglecting the rich heritage of locally crafted attire. This shift reflects not just a change in fashion preferences, but also a broader cultural dependency on Western goods and norms. Recognizing the numerous challenges posed by the second-hand clothing trade, the Kenyan government has made attempts to regulate or even restrict mitumba imports. In 2019, there was a push to limit these imports as part of an effort to revive the local textile industry. However, these efforts have faced significant resistance from informal traders and others whose livelihoods depend on the second-hand clothing market. The political and economic pressure has made it difficult to implement effective regulations, leaving the problem largely unaddressed. In conclusion, while the export of second-hand clothing is often presented as a charitable or eco-friendly act, it is fraught with economic, environmental, social, and cultural challenges. For recipient nations like Kenya, the costs far outweigh the benefits. Addressing this issue requires a multifaceted approach, investing in sustainable waste management, supporting local industries, and fostering cultural pride in locally made products. Only then can we move toward a more equitable and sustainable global textile economy.